Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Community Engaged Research for Environmental Justice, Urban Planning and Community Economic Development. We are excited to have you all join us in this concluding webinar in our series about our book, Ground Truths, Community Engaged Research for Environmental Justice. We know many of you have joined us in past webinars, so welcome back. For others just joining, welcome. My name is Martha Matsuoka. I'm on the Faculty of Urban and Environmental Policy at Occidental College, where I direct the Urban and Environmental Policy Institute, an applied research and community engaged program center on campus. I'm joined today with my friend and co-editor, Chad Raphael from Santa Clara University, along with our wonderful chapter co-authors, Miriam Solis from the University of Texas, Austin, and Isabel Baptista from the Tishman Environmental and Design Center at the New School in New York. Today, I'll start with a brief overview of the goals for our book, and Chad will follow with an overview of the book's contents. And then he'll introduce our guest speakers, starting with Miriam, to present their work and chapter on community economic development, then followed with an introduction of Isabel Baptista to present her chapter on urban planning. We invite you to post questions using the Q&A button on your screens at any time. We'll respond to your questions following the presentations. And as you all know, as you entered our webinar, the webinar is being recorded, and we will email the link to you afterward. So Chad and I had four overarching goals for our book. First, we wanted to focus specifically on community engaged research for environmental justice. We knew there were many excellent books on community engaged research. As well, there were also many excellent works on environmental justice, but there was no single volume that synthesized the community engaged research approach for environmental justice. We also knew we wanted to focus on our primary audience of professional researchers in academia, government, advocacy organizations, recognizing that many of these researchers work or have worked as researchers in community organizations. It was a particular audience, but we knew there were excellent resources available that had been written by our community partners for a community level audience. And our role was to speak for the professional researchers to encourage them to do more and do better. Secondly, we wanted to demonstrate how community engaged research advances EJ by centering local knowledge, building truth from the ground up, producing actionable data that can influence decision-making, and transforming researchers' relationships to communities for equity and mutual benefit. Our third goal was to establish a framework on how CER and EJ align on concepts of justice, and how these concepts apply in various fields of urban planning, public health, conservation, law and policy, community economic development, and food justice and sovereignty. Our fourth goal was to involve multiple perspectives and fields. Now, Chad and I each brought our own experiences and disciplinary perspectives to this book, and yet we recognize that while knowledge is certainly situated in our individual perspectives and experience, it is also produced through relations with others. Because anyone can contribute to research, but none can produce it alone. We knew that we needed additional perspectives beyond our own and more collective authorship. So we reached out to early career Black, Indigenous, and scholars of color who are doing CER in their respective fields and invited them to co-author chapters with us. And you're going to hear for two of them today. And also to note, we wanted to create a book that was widely accessible. So we opted for an ebook, that is something that was downloadable and for free. And so you'll see on the slides as we go through a QR code to download our book. And I will now turn it over to Chad to present the book's contents.
Thank you so much, Martha. It has been such a privilege to work with you on this project and with all of our co-authors. In the book, part one establishes the foundations by defining and describing the development of environmental justice and community engaged research. And it shows why they're especially well suited to each other and offers a current summary of the major literature on both topics. We introduced that framework Martha mentioned that's used throughout the book, which focuses on how researcher community collaborations can advance four dimensions of justice common to community engaged research and environmental justice. Part 2 of the book addresses how community-engaged researchers can collaborate with community partners to co-construct knowledge about EJ. Chapter 3 summarizes the preparatory work and the self-analysis that outside researchers have to do before partnering with EJ communities to address power imbalances and bridge differences. Chapter 4 describes how researchers and community partners address power relations in each of the major stages and elements of community-engaged research. Chapter 5 addresses the barriers to conducting this kind of research within higher education and how they might be dismantled. Part 3 explores the ways that community-engaged research has been applied to EJ across disciplines. Each chapter presents an overview of community-engaged research in this domain, some exemplary case studies, and some directions for future research. This part includes the chapters that you'll be hearing from today, chapters 8 on community economic development and chapter 11 on urban and regional planning. Again, we encourage you to post questions throughout, and we will aim to address as many of them as we can at the end. We may combine some questions. And again, this webinar is recorded, and we will email links to the recording to everybody, all of you who are here today and anyone who registered, so that you can watch it or circulate it to your networks. So now I get to introduce Miriam and Anna. Miriam Solis is an assistant professor of community and regional planning at the University of Texas at Austin. She draws on environmental justice theory and research to examine the role of environmental education and workforce development in the planning, design, and operation of urban infrastructure. She's a community-based participatory researcher who frequently collaborates with nonprofit organizations and government agencies. Dr. Solis was a 2020 to 2022 UT Austin Humanities Institute Fellow for her work on youth perspectives on racial justice and decarbonization. Anna Isabel Baptista is at the New School, where she's an associate professor in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management graduate program and co-director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center. Collaborating directly with EJ organizations and coalitions, Anna focuses on environmental justice policies, climate justice, and land use and zoning tools for EJ. Her professional practice is based primarily in community-engaged scholarship and critical participatory action research. And you can see links to their full bios in the registration form for this webinar. So let me go ahead and unshare my screen and invite Miriam to go ahead and share her screen. And I'll turn off my video and turn it over to Miriam.
Hello, everyone.
Yep, there.
Wonderful. Sounds like I'm all set up. Chad and Martha, thank you for that warm welcome. And I want to express my gratitude. I want to express my gratitude for being a part of this collaborative project. I feel like I might be having technical difficulties, but I'll wait until folks let me know if I do. That's why I'm tripping up a bit, but I'm going to move forward. It's been, being a part of this project has been such an instructive experience for me. I've learned a lot from Chad and Martha. That's my photo on that slide. But writing this chapter was very much a collaborative effort. And I think one of the additional joys of being part of this big project is learning from all of the other authors in the book. I'm going to be presenting on community and economic development. And one of the things that compelled us in writing this chapter has to do with the history of the environmental justice movement itself. Colonialism and racism have been very much central to capitalism. These have been top-down approaches that have extracted wealth and harmed communities. And unfortunately, what we have seen over time is that large institutions, oftentimes responsible for community and economic development, very much are beholden to the interests of entities that want to continue to accumulate wealth. So what we have seen is that there are severe economic implications, and there's been an established relationship to environmental degradation, and this in turn has harmed historically marginalized communities. In reflecting upon this, we turned to the principles of environmental justice. The principles of environmental justice were developed by delegates to the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991. And these principles, particularly in the United States, but also as these become conversations and efforts of cross-place, have been used in a wide range of contexts to identify environmental justice priorities, concerns, and visions for the future. And one of the things I want to point to in this slide is on that right-hand panel, the extent to which these principles talk about the economy or economic alternatives. For example, they point to the need for economic self-determination, the rights of all workers, destructive operations of multinational corporations, and ideas of consumption. The principles call for economic and cultural liberation. And so we see in the environmental justice movement's early onset, a very strong call to rethink local economies. And this has been done in response to dominant development paradigms. So even though capitalism has been a constant in previous centuries, we see new instantiations that create new problems for communities. And dominant development paradigms that are discussed in the book include neoliberalism, and then we call out sustainable development and participatory development as specific manifestations of the problematic adaptations of neoliberalism. So when we talk about neoliberalism, we're referring to the prescription for growth that emerged in the 1980s. It liberalized trade, it privatized markets and deregulated them, or privatized public services. And it also reduced labor protections. So from the 1980s to the present, we've seen a dismantling of a lot of the protections that communities have built. And one of the examples that scholars have written about with regard to this problem has been how neoliberalism really damaged the community and economic development relations that communities had built as part of the civil rights movement, as part of the Black Power movement. Community-led organizations and efforts were established, and because social services were privatized, these organizational networks were also harmed in the process. More recently, we have seen how sustainable development has promoted extractive and exploitative growth. Sustainable development is often very celebrated because it's a model that finally tries to capture or equally prioritize environmental, ethical, and economic interests. But what we have seen over time, and what many efforts have pointed out, is that in sustainable development initiatives, what is actually oftentimes prioritized are natural protections and the economy, and there's little regard to the ethical implications of that work, particularly with regard to the experiences of historically marginalized communities. Because folks across place and trying to do good within institutions have pointed out that a lot of the reason that these approaches have very problematic outcomes is that people aren't involved. We don't have built out processes for engagement. Participatory development, or communicative planning, as we oftentimes refer to it in my field, has emerged to try to better engage communities in community and economic development processes. But what we have actually seen is that a lot of these efforts can be co-opted by state and intergovernmental organizations, oftentimes because the plans for development have been developed prior to these engagements and then presented for communities. And sometimes these participatory efforts end up being stamps of approval for particular forms of development. Now, that was a very sad slide in terms of the consequences of what happens with these particular economic development models. But what is very exciting is that, as I've pointed out, there have been these alternative models to development that have been presented over time, and some very exciting ones that are more recent. And here I'm going to present 6 that we point out in the book. And these are alternatives to development coming from different places around the world. Buen Vivir, for example, opposes the concept of perpetual accumulation and thinks beyond the concept of economic value. Ecological Swaraj in India places emphasis on self-reliance by respecting the limits of the earth. Ubuntu in Southern Africa prescribes an ethic of caring for others and natural beings, as well as the restrained use and sharing of natural resources. 3 more models that have emerged and are picking up momentum to different extents and across different places are degrowth, which calls for the downscaling of production and consumption, social and solidarity economies, and these are grassroots initiatives that foster cooperation and mutual aid, and a regenerative economy, which includes restoring nature, local economic control, and democratic workplaces. So building on these examples, as well as our existing relationships with community-based organizations, we identified 4 emergent strategies for using community-engaged research to advance economic alternatives. These are relocalizing economies, community-led worker education and training, just transitions for labor and communities to a decarbonized economy, and community ownership of production. One of the things I want to point out is these strategies were prominent in the examples that we looked at, and I'm going to present a case study that we identified as very instructive for each of these strategies, but these strategies are not necessarily mutually exclusive or exhaustive. For example, one of the things you'll see in the case studies is that community ownership of production can also involve the relocalization of the economy. One of the things that we also do in the chapter is point out some of the strengths and challenges as these initiatives unfolded. And very briefly, I'm going to take us back to the overarching book framework and how these specific cases link back to this particular dimensions of environmental justice. So in distributive justice, in these examples, we see how the community engaged research strengthens investment in community capacities to conduct research. Procedural justice is evident in asserting historically marginalized communities' participation in the development of alternative economies. And recognition justice is evident in applying local knowledge and values to train workers. Transformation is evident in changes to economic structures and relations, and that is certainly evident across all 4 examples that I'm going to introduce. Relocalizing the economy is the first strategy that cuts across many cases that we saw, and this involves drawing on local knowledge and values to promote local production of goods, services, and food. It stands in opposition to neoliberals' intensification of globalized processes of production. And one of the things I want to point out about relocalization is that it very rarely involves complete self-sufficiency, but one of the tenets, rather, that relocalization aspires to is the connectivity between different relocalization efforts so that residents, communities across place can equitably benefit from and democratically participate in deciding trading terms. One example of relocalization that's become very prominent in community and economic development circles here in the United States is Cleveland's Anchor Institution Framework. And it started as a CER partnership between Democracy Collaborative, a think tank, and the Cleveland Foundation. And at the onset, this joint effort involved 200 interviews. And as part of the findings, the research collaborators were drawn to the university circle's $3 million in procurement spending. University Circle is a hub in Cleveland of educational and medical institutions. These are generally very large institutions that are rooted in place. And as a result of that finding, community members, local government, philanthropic organizations, and these eds and meds, educational institutions and medical institutions, came together to support the establishment of the Evergreen Cooperatives. And one of the ways in which they do that is by committing long-term contracts with the cooperatives. And the cooperatives include Evergreen Cooperative Laundry, Ohio Cooperative Solar, and Green City Growers. And currently, the cooperatives hire more than 200 people, many of whom are formerly incarcerated and U.S. citizens. One of the things that came of the Cleveland model is an anchor institution framework that helps conceptualize what it means to leverage these local institutions rooted in place in ways that keep the wealth local, in ways that benefit local residents. And of course, these involve a wide range of other local actors. The second strategy I'm going to talk about is education and training, which involves increasing the knowledge, skills, and capacities of workers or organizational members. And building the capabilities of people based on their existing knowledge and local priorities challenges corporate models in which technical experts with little connection to place drive decision-making. So the ongoing education and training of workers has the goal of ending community self-reliance on these harmful corporate working conditions. And one of the ways in which we've seen very effective models of CER in place with regard to this question is through labor centers that exist at large educational institutions in the United States. The University of California has 2 labor centers, and Cornell University has the Workers Institute. And recently they've been working on a labor leading on climate initiative, which involves building the leadership of workers so they can be at the forefront of responding, of conceptualizing how institutions respond to the climate crisis. The case study that we highlight in the book is that of Barefoot College. Now, we didn't necessarily do that because they have a strong CER track record. Rather, we did it because they have been at the forefront of advancing workforce development models that are participatory to a really great extent and provide an important model of how to do bottom-up organizing in order to create those models. So Barefoot College has a training model with 4 key components of alternative education, valuing traditional knowledge and skills, learning for self-reliance and dissemination. It prioritizes recruiting women and low-caste people. It draws on and builds member social capital. So as the Barefoot model has been looked to as a model for workforce planning, other places around the world are directly engaging with the women who are making decisions at Barefoot College because there's no hierarchy in the organization. And all of the women earn a living wage. And so one of the things that's been very celebrated, one of the outcomes that's been very celebrated of this model is that women who came to the college, as an example, women who came to the college who didn't necessarily know how to read or had never been part of the formal economy have become successful water engineers or solar engineers. And this photo in their online materials highlights that endeavor. Another strategy that we highlight in the chapter is just transition. By just transition, we are referring to decarbonization that mitigates and redresses the inequities experienced by people whose lives are dependent on a fossil fuel economy and or who lack reliable access to energy supplies. The concept emerged from the labor movement in the 1990s and has broadened as labor community alliances formed in the environmental justice movement. One of the things I want to point out is that it's often associated to energy, but local movements have taken its definition to point out that energy and a low carbon future actually points out or intersects with a lot of domains, such as water and green spaces. So the concept has been applied across domains as a way of envisioning a post-carbon future. The case study that we dig into in the book is that of the Black Mesa Water Coalition. This is a coalition founded by Navajo, Hopi, and Chicano students at Northern Arizona University. And it started with students, but formalized into a coalition that then launched campaigns in response to the extracting industries that were operating in the Navajo Nation. So one of the realities that the coalition wanted to challenge is, despite the presence of these extractive industries, nearly 50% of local residents were unemployed. In addition to that, the workers experienced harmful workplace conditions. So the coalition developed a green jobs campaign to change the Navajo economy and democratize tribal government. And as part of their community-led research, they led dialogue circles and found that traditional ways of subsistence would be critical to translating green into Navajo. So one of the very important insights that other CER movements and efforts can take from this is that what constitutes good green jobs is contextual, and the research process can help identify what that might mean in their respective context. The last strategy that I'm going to cover is community-based ownership, involving local control and governance over land and means of production. And I want to link it back to those dominant economic models that we talked about in the beginning of the presentation. So this is an alternative to corporate-led models of governance. In these particular cases, communities have decision-making power, not only about with regard to what is being produced and how, but what the trading terms are. And community land trusts are examples of community based ownership as well. These emerged, actually, a very important part of their history is that they're rooted in the civil rights movement. So again, there's a genealogy between what communities are advancing as economic alternatives and the history of movements that environmental justice is connected to. The case study that I'm going to talk about here is that of Cooperation Jackson, and specifically its community production initiative. So Cooperation Jackson is advancing a model of eco-socialism through a Black-led community lands trust on 7.4 acres of land. And its Center for Community Production seeks to bring manufacturing to workers and communities. And through a partnership with the City University of New York, it identified models for prefabricated modular home concept designs for its Ewing Street Eco Village pilot project. And this particular initiative seeks to bring the principles of community ownership with housing and well-being. One of the things that we discussed as we went through these cases is that there's they raise a few questions about the role of large educational institutions. We have an example of the Cleveland model, where a very large think tank that was very well resourced was involved. But then we have Cooperation Jackson, which is very much a grassroots model that is being community driven. And so we point out in our chapter the different extents to which institutions that are well resourced can be involved. And one of the things we prompt readers to think about is the flexibility needed within those large institutions in order to respond to communities' priorities. What it also points out, though, is the incredible community capacity that local efforts are developing in order to do what we might conceive as research, right? So they're either building their own internal research capacities or determining, shaping the right partnerships that are responsive to their priorities. So one of the things that we end with is a reflection on how we bring these examples to scale. So the economy is massive and continues to, the current dominant paradigms continue to be driven by commitments to growth. And the examples that we've presented today have emerged from local community-based efforts, and they raise the question of how do we bring them to scale? And so one of the things that we were prompted to think about, and we would love to continue to have this conversation with you all here and elsewhere, is that local initiatives ought to scale up, but that scaling needs to be influenced and supported by laws and policies, so that the innovations that they're generating can travel across place faster, and that community economic innovators can aim for scaling deeper as well by thinking about how these ideas can better reflect local cultural norms and beliefs as a way of developing new resonant narratives that can build stronger relationships both within the community and across communities. And that does it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for presenting that work and presenting it so clearly. As you unshare your screen and turn off video, and Mike and Anna turns hers on and shares her screens, let me just remind people that we welcome your questions in the Q&A. Feel free to put them in any time, and if we have time, we'll get to as many as we can. All yours, Anna.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Well, Miriam's a tough act to follow, but I'm going to do my best because I think our chapters really speak well to one another in terms of the themes and the sort of underlying systems that shape both economic and planning systems. They really go hand in hand. So I think you'll hear a lot of echoes in our chapters and in our presentations. And I too want to thank Chad and Martha for your support and guidance and invitation really to join this amazing collection of authors and voices and insights about community engaged research for environmental justice. So it was a real privilege to be part of this group and contribute a little piece of it in the context of urban and regional planning, because for many of us who were trained in sort of a traditional planning discipline, there are a lot of things we could say. It was sort of a daunting chapter to take on, to be honest, because I was like, oh, we're gonna, try to run through the entire Western canon of planning and everything that's wrong with it. But also what a wonderful opportunity to unpack those canons and really look at them critically and look at the alternatives that communities have brought forward, and how community engaged research and practice has really informed that. So just a little bit, I'll start with the overview around why planning is in particular intersecting with community engaged research and environmental justice, and the ways that it intersects with different types of justice, dimensions of justice. So many environmental justice struggles and conflicts are grounded in land use and place-based conflicts that have real deep roots in the origins of, sort of racist planning practices, not only of the past, but that continue to reverberate in our society today, both in visible and very material ways, but invisible structural and institutional ways. So it is very much still part of the fabric of and the legacy of environmental racism that we have today. So urban planning and regional planning are very much complicit in the environmental injustices we have today, that communities are grappling with. And the community engaged research in urban planning really shows up in lots of different ways. Sometimes the most obvious is the distributive forms of justice, because we think about how communities in particular have looked at data and documented the environmental harms on the ground, the disproportionate siting of pollution and the unequal distribution and maldistribution of harms. And so we really see that maldistribution and the ability of residents and local organizers to document that and document the distributive injustice as part of their community engaged research practices and planning practices. CER has also shown up in many ways around community-led planning efforts to really upend the traditional models of participation in planning processes, from sort of very superficial passive planning, participation in planning, to really centering community-led and community-driven visions, that have real consequence and power. So there's lots to be said there about, and I'll reflect a little bit in the cases around how community engaged research has really problematized traditional participation processes and planning. And then, of course, there's recognition justice, whose knowledge, whose expertise is valued and centered in planning practice. And in community engaged research, we know that it's so important to center local, grassroots, frontline knowledge and an intersectional approach, right, to planning. And transformative justice, right, which is really getting at those systems and structures of planning, and in some cases upending them and replacing them with alternative systems altogether. And many EJ communities throughout the world are really innovating in this space. So I'm going to keep going here. I'll take you I'm not going to go on the whirlwind of the Western planning canon and all that's wrong with it, but simply say that there are obvious roots in US planning context and in Europe of a Western model of planning that's very top-down, very professionally driven and elite-driven, very much grounded in market logics. So Miriam talked a lot about, the neoliberal, capitalist systems that drive the economy, but also drive planning as well. And the ideas of rational planning, which were very top down, and were very much about efficiency, logics of order, and beauty, that were very much informed by racist and settler colonial notions of a rational city and a rational town planning. So things like garden cities and Le Corbusier's radiant city, these are all sort of the traditional models that I know I learned about. And if you were in planning school, you probably learned about them. And what we saw in the Western canon was in the 1960s, communities really started to, that wasn't when they started to, but there was a real pushback to reform these models led by progressive planners and more equity-driven public planners. And so you start to see the rise of progressive planning, things like equity planning and advocacy planning. But many of these were still, these progressive models were still very much centered around the state and public professional planners. And even though they promised a sort of opening up and access to planning processes to civil society, it was still very much driven by a form of participation that was, I would call it light participation in the terms of how communities were engaged, but not necessarily leading. They weren't the major agents of planning in progressive planning. And then there's one really ongoing and models from all over the world in the global South and here in the US of radical planning that really tries to depart from professional planning practices and the planner in the state and the state itself as the center of interventions and how we shape our cities. And you see things like, the Right to the City and Slum Dwellers International and Black radical traditions really, and indigenous planning practices really coming forward and upending a lot of what more traditional planning approaches. And some of the key things that come out of this, really this continuum of planning traditions, is that in the environmental justice space, where you see a lot of community engaged research and practice, there's a real rethinking and reshaping of what is the role of the state, and how do we define expertise, and trying to recenter around different valuing different knowledges and community experiential and expertise and grassroots leadership and voices, different forms of participation that look at shared power, and power that emanates from democratic practices, and an opening up of who's really who are the agents of change, rather than passive participation. And then really looking at the goals of planning. What is the goal of urban planning in terms of self-determination, liberation, much more transformative goals for planning's purpose. Yeah, so the fun stuff in the chapter, for me at least, was really having the opportunity to look across this really beautifully diverse spectrum of community engaged research and practice in the environmental justice and the climate justice movements, and see sort of the wealth of community-led urban planning and regional planning practices that were happening, and really innovative work that speaks to the expertise and the agency of environmental justice organizations and frontline communities in not only developing their own plans, but moving those plans forward as part of their broader organizing or advocacy campaigns, that many of which were quite intersectional. So some of I won't go through all, there are many examples that are in the chapter that I tried to really simplify in these tables, but there are links there so that people can really, if they're interested, dig deep and explore them in more depth. So I apologize in advance to all the amazing environmental justice organizations who are featured here, because I'm sure I didn't do justice to all of the work that is reflected in these very short table summaries. But I tried to do a little bit of a typology of some of the examples of community engaged research that cut across community planning initiatives, things that we think of have been in the realm of public and local municipal planning, like community master plans or open space and recreation plans, and those types of plans that were traditionally in the purview of those municipal planners. Many communities took upon themselves to do and lead out, and then bring forward as alternatives to state and municipal led plans. And then you have really great examples also in climate and disaster planning, where we see many environmental justice communities really at the forefront of climate resiliency, climate adaptation planning, because those communities are hit first and worst by climate change. They were very much a part of trying to envision what would be the future of their own communities, and taking into consideration, interestingly, the unintended consequences of climate mitigation interventions that would further gentrify their communities. So this notion of climate gentrification and green displacement was very much on the mind of groups like Uprose, who looked at alternatives to industrial redevelopment that was happening in their communities, and tried to propose a reindustrialization, a green reindustrialization for their waterfronts that spoke to climate resiliency, but also anchored their communities and tried to fortify them against displacement. And then we have great examples, many examples to choose from. Actually, for this table, is really hard to get down to a few, of community science and air pollution research, community engaged research that happened with many organizations, really documenting and ground truthing the disproportionate burdens faced by communities, and much of that research that communities did on the ground formed the basis of what became later cumulative impacts policies and ordinances like green zones that had a real material impact on protecting communities in the future. So wonderful examples there from groups like El Puente and the LA Collaborative for Environmental Health and Justice. And then finally, there's a group of examples I try to give, and I think Miriam also spoke to this around green infrastructure investments and planning. There's a lot of really great planning right now that's happening and that has happened around many different types of public and private infrastructures. And this includes food infrastructures, energy infrastructures, transportation infrastructures, and beyond, and waste infrastructures that communities are actively planning around and trying to influence through their own visioning practices, alternatives building. We have great examples, particularly around community-owned solar project planning, food-related planning projects. And now with all this federal funding coming from the IRA and investments from the Infrastructure Act, there are even more opportunities for communities to enter into this infrastructure planning to propose their own alternatives to what they need in their communities. So I'm going to end here so we have time for some questions, but some of the things that really stood out, I think for me in being able to sort of curate this amazing list of case studies of community-led, community-driven planning, is that there are really a wealth of movement actors that are, many of which are operating either outside the state in formal planning practices, or they're collaborating with them as one of the many stakeholders they're working with to articulate their own vision for the future and push back against the idea that the only way to plan your community is to use these market-driven logics, right? That there are other aims that communities have and can propose. And that there's obviously a thread here throughout the whole book, but certainly in our 2 chapters around privileging and prioritizing local knowledge in democratic practices, things like well-being, and of course, environmental justice in the planning proposals of these communities. And just like the depth of expertise and insight and innovation that's happening by community-led planning is, really incredible. And I think underappreciated, at least in the planning profession sometimes, where I think professional planners or the state see communities as sort of, afterthoughts in their planning processes, or are engaged or passive actors. In fact, communities are at the forefront and leading efforts. And there's really exciting work happening in communities on the horizon around reparative and just transition planning practices. Miriam talked about the just transition models, and there's some really great planning and visioning that communities are doing on the ground in these particular traditions. And I talk about 2 of them: the Just Transition Planning Guide that was done with Climate Justice Alliance, and the Renewable Rikers, which is a sort of a reparative form of planning that's happened in New York City, as great examples of that. But yeah, so really exciting examples happening today on urban planning and community engaged research for environmental justice in the urban planning space that I think we can take a lot of inspiration from. And I'll stop there so we have time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. And just want to invite Anna and Miriam to go ahead and turn on your cameras at this point. I'm just really reminded of how each of you have such an extensive view of the EJ issues in your fields, and such a deep knowledge of how community engaged research has contributed to them, and such a wealth of examples, right, in both of your chapters. So really encourage people to read them. I have one question so far in the Q&A, so I'm going to go ahead and read that one out and invite other people to contribute. This one is primarily about community economic development. So I'm going to throw it to Miriam first and then invite Anna to comment as well if she would like to. And this is a person who's saying, hey, increasing local initiatives for community economic development was talked about as a challenge. What are some of the key policy recommendations or strategies that have been suggested to effectively facilitate this scaling process that Miriam talked about at the end? And she really talked about 3 different kinds of scaling. So, Miriam, whenever you want to chime in on that one, and Anna, feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to this question, and I appreciate that it was posed. I think that this is an ongoing conversation, and I'm sure a few of the folks tuning in have are part of either efforts or have some ideas on how to pursue this. We can think about scaling with regard to those 4 strategies that we presented in the chapter. So relocalization, education and training, a just transition, and community ownership. And maybe I'll start with community ownership. So there's been quite a bit of research on how, for example, municipalities can support the development of community land trusts. A lot of municipalities are the primary landowners of their jurisdictions. Utilities tend to own a lot of land, and other agencies tend to own a lot of land. So there's a lot of potential there, not only on what to do with their existing land, but what to do with land that's been abandoned or that is sitting idle in a very dense area. So how cities think about their policies with regard to community land trusts is one example, but that still doesn't necessarily address the question, because we can still think about municipalities as local entities. And so I think that there's a question of the role of state and federal governments. And one of the ways in which I think about the role of the federal government and supporting this effort or these alternative economic development efforts is with regard to the question of labor. So we're fortunate to be at a time where there's a lot of investment in communities. It's been really the last couple of years where we've seen these huge federal investments that are dedicated to environmental justice explicitly, and they have a workforce and education and training component. But in a lot of places, those investments, if they're not paired with worker rights and career pipelines, we're not going to see the impact that they can have. So we still live in a context where we have right to work states. These are states where the labor movement has been particularly weakened through state policy. And so what I would say is that it's an ongoing discussion, the need to continue to call back attention to what distinct entities can do, right? We see these community-led innovations. How can local jurisdictions support them? But it's going to take us back to the question of the state and the state at large, certainly the state literally, but also the federal government, and how it's going to support local economies through the tax code, through business policy. And of course, I do think that then feeds into a global conversation, but I think this conversation in terms of specific responses speaks to where folks are situated and the levers that they can pull within that context.
Cool. I got some questions for Anna too. Here's one, which is that as community folks successfully impact planners and planning departments and reshape their practices, how do the radical possibilities continue to exist? Did you see examples in cases where capture and dilution was avoided or resisted?
It's a great question. And I have to be honest, I haven't been tracking the sort of the capture and dilution. I'm sure it's happening in many places. Like I guess the one that's closest to me is in New York City, right? Where you have a city like New York that has environmental justice policies. They've enacted several ordinances on environmental justice. And yet they proposed this whole rezoning to increase housing stock, supposedly to improve access to affordable housing. Of course, it's very highly contested whether it actually produces anything affordable. But in the meantime, communities really pushed back on this notion of rezoning and upzoning because of the gentrification implications, and really expose the city's double talk, right? Where, on the one hand, they have this seemingly very progressive environmental justice policies on the books, but then they're moving economic and development policy that's very much pro-market, right? And privatization and driving a totally different model of development. And the way that Uprose really amazingly stopped this multi-million-dollar industry city development rezoning that was going to turn a whole industrial corridor into luxury housing and commercial corridor for the gentry. And they really did old school direct action and alternative, right? They did a whole great alternative proposal and said, we can reimagine this whole place. We don't need the gentry to reclaim our waterfronts and create jobs for our communities. And so it was a real abject lesson for the city, because I think the city was really surprised that they got pushback on this proposal, and was met with a lot of contestation there. So it really requires, I think, that those anchor EJ organizers and grassroots organizers to expose the contradictions that public planning brings forward. And yeah, so that's one example. I'm sure there's many others. That'd be a really interesting thing to explore in more depth, though. It's a great question.
And we have one more question, time for one more question, which each of you should feel free to weigh in on, obviously in the time that we have left. The question is about planning programs, noting that planning programs continue to offer courses, academic programs that privilege the status quo, right? So capitalist neoliberal urbanism, neoclassical economics. What are the changes? What are the trends, the possible changes, like programs that are introducing other visions of economics, like the ones that you all have mentioned? Can you offer recommendations to accelerate these changes in how we teach people about your fields? Either of you should feel free to chime in first.
Miriam, you want to go?
I'll go, but I really want to hear Anna's response. One of the things I tell my students is, to some degree, you're all being trained in economic development, even though that's not your explicit focus. Because as Anna was saying, and this question points out, our field is so deeply embedded and invested in economic development in these traditional growth models. And so I think one of the things that where this chapter helped me, actually, so this is more of a reflection rather than what can we do more concretely. I think that we're actually seeing one of the things we ought to reclaim, and I say that very humbly, is that these social and environmental justice efforts do have economic implications. And are themselves interventions for current traditional economic development paradigms. So I actually think the work is already being done, and theory within the planning field on abolition, racial capitalism. There's great work on property, questioning the basis of property being put forth by Indigenous scholars. I think that's what can lead how we think about economy and economic development. So I don't think we actually, I think it would be helpful to look outside of our fields for ideas and synergies, but I actually also think that we have very transformative work coming from within.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot more to offer. I actually am not in an urban planning. I teach in an environmental policy and a critical policy frame. And I'm lucky at the New School that we do have a lot of heterodox economists and critical studies and a critical focus in both in a lot of the disciplinary fields we teach. So we offer students a wide array of critical disciplinary approaches. But I would say sometimes I feel like we got to teach planning outside planning schools. Like we have to introduce radical and critical planning and insurgent models in lots of different disciplines, design, environment, economic. We have to introduce these across many disciplines and try to, I don't know, maybe this is crazy, like try to, to reform the whole planning pedagogy. I think you have to also get at some of these, the ACSP, these academic planning, consortiums to really rethink and reformulate their formula for how they're training the next generation of planning professionals and planning academicians, so that they're not as heavily biased and inculcated into those Western notions, which is why maybe sometimes we need to blow up the planning schools and start, mixing it up with other disciplines, because some of them I fear are too fully invested in those market logics to break completely free from them and introduce real alternatives. So maybe popular planning schools, that's what we need. Community planning schools.
Thank you both so much. Because we're at time, if you have any other questions that you didn't have a chance to get answered today, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Be happy to put you in touch, with Anna or Miriam, or you can reach out to them directly. Our webinar series has come to an end today. We will send you a follow-up email with links to recordings of this webinar and all the previous ones in the series. You can download the open access book. And so we encourage you to continue the conversation individually and offline. I would just close by saying some of the most important things we can do to transform academia are also talked about in a chapter in the book. And a lot of it has to do with who we hire, who we promote, how we value their scholarship, including community engaged research. So transforming the people and then transforming our institutions to value these ideas and these connections with community, and having community folks drive our curricula with us, right? Rather than us deciding exactly how and what this gets taught. So, and there's lots more ideas in that chapter. So thanks everybody for coming today. Really appreciate your being here, and hope you have a great end to your week.